By 3 a.m., another major objective of the forces in the Austin battle, including the Russian Army's 207th Motor Rifle Division of their larger 2nd Combined Arms Army, with one of two of their combat engineer battalions, as each of their comprising two brigades that made up the 207th had one each, with the one in the north having had laid their PMP pontoon bridge, leaving one combat company of combat engineers and their headquarters and support company effectively to guard it, as a mechanized infantry battalion, having had earlier cleared the flanks, was now crossing behind the 6 combat engineer companies of combat engineers that were clearing the I-35 invasion corridor for the external invasion components, along with a People's Armed Police battalion going on down the line until reaching downtown, as the combat engineers would do the same, reaching the north of downtown, whereupon they would achieve one of the major objectives of this campaign in the Austin battle, which was to take the Cap building as much intact as was humanly possible for use by the Chinese as their colonial governor residence after the nation would be defeated, and also take the political leadership alive, as these were all high-value individuals. And before the invasion had officially kicked off, at the very late hour of midnight, the state military leadership of the Army and Air National Guard had left Camp Mabry to meet with the political leadership at the state level in the Cap building when Camp Mabry was heavily hit by Chinese and Russian tactical ballistic and cruise missile strikes, as well as Russian air and artillery strikes, leaving it as a smoldering crater, knocking out one objective right then and there. As now the combat engineers, after having had spent the previous few hours clearing the flanks on the way to the Cap complex, now had 2 of their 6 combat companies of combat engineers spearheading the assault against the fortified Cap building, as the state's paramilitary forces of the Texas DPS, or Department of Public Safety, which was a paramilitary formation of Texas forces, as well as the Texas Rangers, who had snipers and other personnel in the area, as the DPS had also been given military-grade weaponry in the form of MRAPs and even light machine guns, and these had been issued to their forces to defend the Cap building, as sandbags had even been trucked in to create sandbag machine gun emplacements, along with portable chain link fencing, the same type that had been used before in the National Cap building to effectively protect it from any types of riots or other civil disturbances. Effectively, the Russian combat engineer forces, again as mentioned before previously several times, they were like elite assault infantry forces who had been sent into some of the most heavily fortified areas on Earth to crush them, and they had done so with a high degree of skill and proficiency. And this fortified area would be relatively easy for their vehicles to simply smash right over the portable fencing, as well as also the sandbag emplacements, destroying them with loitering munition support, even if needed, artillery support, as also the BM-21 Grad Rocket Battalion, its firing batteries all firing at the same time to the north of the Cap building in a massive time-on-target attack against a large neighborhood within the north of downtown, which even included also a portion of the University of Texas, which would be heavily shelled by rockets, as a massive cluster of armed reactionary civilians had gathered in this area, and the Russians had gathered the coordinates of all of these different personnel in their technicals and private civilian vehicles, as pickup trucks and SUVs with armed men were technically technicals by definition, as well as also even cars and other vehicles, as multiple groupings of armed civilians were effectively bunching up in this area and trying to communicate and figure out what was going on, and they were all in the area, arms in hand, and were deemed a threat by Russian coalition forces, and thus they would be massively rocketed out of existence by the BM-21 Grads firing a massive time-on-target attack just to the north of the Cap building. To the south of the Cap building, the two S-19 MSTA howitzers would once again fire into this area, as they had earlier shelled much of this portion of the city into total ruins already, and they would be firing again against armed reactionary civilians trying to attack against the inbound combat engineering forces of the company that was tasked with actually taking the Cap building, in a scene very reminiscent of when Soviet troops in World War II were taking the German chancellery at the very end of the war in the Battle of Berlin, at least the war in Europe, that is. As now, a very similar scene would erupt with the Russian combat engineering forces moving in to capture from the paramilitary forces defending it the American state cap building of the state of Texas, with all of its leadership inside, which were to be taken alive for the purposes of tribunals in China, as they would all be shipped to China with all other regime leadership at the state and federal levels, and they would be broadcast on national TV as they would undergo their trials in the Chinese kangaroo court systems, as they would be held accountable for everything that they've ever done wrong against the Chinese regime, as well as other regimes who would have a say in these show trials. As the Russian combat engineers heavily assaulted the quasi-fortified Cap building, as the Russians would plant their flag atop of this building, much like the Soviets planted the flag on the Reichstag after taking it. The Chinese Communist Party flag, as well as the national flag of China, would also be planted on this building, and it would be draped with red banners as a sign of Chinese domination and victory, with a massive oil painting of Xi to be set out in front of it, just like they would do in the national cap after that battle had concluded, as currently, as many battles were going on around the entire nation, even the nation's cap was under heavy assault, and it would take several days to capture it by the Chinese and Pakistani forces in the area, as well as also Belarusians, who were also assisting in that campaign. As for Texas and the South Central invasion sector, the Chinese and Russian forces operating all up and down I-35 were capturing all of their various objectives, whether political, whether military, or whether in terms of industry or technology, such as the American tech companies that were heavily rocketed and hit by airstrikes out of existence, as well as missile strikes. These were considered military targets, all because they worked with DARPA and the DoD, so thus they were struck by the coalition's heavy firepower, and now the political targets were being captured as well, as this was seen as another major objective, as even the People's Armed Police in Del Valle had recently captured one of the nation's top senators, as the federal level senator had been home at the time in Texas, as he was not in the nation's cap, which was also experiencing a major battle at this time. As the combat engineers, with their infantry fighting vehicles, their armor personnel carriers, and of course their armored engineering vehicles in each platoon, had smashed their way into the cap complex, and the Russian troops, with their squad automatic machine guns, effectively their RPK-74s, as well as their RPG-29 Vampire systems, which were very potent anti-armor systems. They also had even more powerful Kornet, man-portable anti-tank guided missiles as well. The heavy weapons, however, would be limited against this building, as it was not desired to destroy the building, although they had to fight the paramilitary personnel trying to defend it. But limited usage of 100mm fire would be used, as the IFV here would fire a single 100mm shell through the window back further into the building, which would blast out a portion of the wall and eliminate many of the defenders inside, as small arms and heavy machine guns would be usually the typical weapons that were being utilized, along with loitering munitions equipped with fragmentation warheads set on AI target-seeking mode as it pertained to the Russian Lancet 3s, as a loitering munition had struck a sniper on the roof that was trying to defend the structure, with those inside firing out of windows, as well as those that were in their sandbag positions, as there's still some firing from here, but one took one in the cranial area here, as well as over here from this MTLB fire from their heavy DSHK 12.7mm machine gun, as the blood of many was literally running in the streets, as many were being hit by these savage attacks with not just small arms, but heavy weapons as well, such as the heavy machine guns. And artillery strikes would come in and annihilate the remaining buildings, as the quadcopter assets had spotted armed reactionary civilians trying to take cover within them, as well as also loitering munition strikes. This is a Wing-Lung 2 dedicated combat drone of the Chinese that was patrolling I-35 in the area and had swooped down, got a missile lock on a target, and fired one of its HJ-10 anti-tank missiles. It was also armed with the CM502KG dual-purpose anti-ship anti-tank missiles, and that was being fired around the other side of this building at targets on the highway. As this was all very devastating, the paramilitary forces fell in the dozens, as they were simply unable to defend the premises, as the Russian attack from the company that was assaulting the CAP complex was simply too strong. This is simply the west wing of the CAP building, and these are loitering munitions with fragmentation warheads. This is a M249 gunner over here, a paramilitary soldier of the Americans, along with one with an M4. Most of them were equipped with M4 rifles, but they were being eliminated, as this one in here took some rounds in the window here, and rounds were smacking all into this area as well. All the windows had been basically knocked out. Fighting was devastating. Again, it resembled Berlin in 1945, as most American cities did by now. The total war, the high-intensity war, was all-encompassing, and it was highly destructive. And again, they were trying to preserve this building as much as possible, because it was going to be a symbol of Chinese domination once they could drape their red banners and hang their party and national flag over it. And the Russians would plant their flag as well, as they were the ones that actually captured the building. And they, with China, were the two coalition leaders, Russia and China. And as the combat engineers were fighting for control over this building, the forces were effectively moving through this part of the city right here, and a heavy rocket barrage was slamming into the north of the CAP complex in this neighborhood here, as again, time on target technique was being used with all of the firing batteries of the Grad Rocket Battalion firing at the same area, which encompassed the neighborhoods north of the CAP building, but also part of the University of Texas. And the sports stadium was again north of this area as well. This was part of the Austin Light Rail, which also went underground. This is the Waterloo Park, which a battle was breaking out here between armed reactionary civilians that had sought cover in this area, as well as others trying to move through the area to escape the rocket barrage, which was already claiming many lives, as those on the periphery of it were outright annihilated by this barrage. Technicals and personnel simply eliminated by this savage display of heavy firepower that was unleashed upon this area. As this area had already been heavily shelled by Russian artillery strikes, that was for the purpose of eradicating earlier armed reactionary civilian groups. More artillery from the 2S-19 MSTA howitzer battalion would be fired into this area as these shells, again, would strike the few remaining buildings as well as also the rubble piles that had used to be buildings to effectively annihilate these counterattacks that were ad hoc counterattacks against the Russian combat engineer company entering the area to seize control of the cap building like so. As they were moving in a line with staggered weapons to have 360-degree security around their entire formation, Russian loitering munitions, which were equipped with the fragmentation warheads as it pertained to their Lancet 3s, were crashing into armed reactionary civilians, hitting their vehicles and destroying them as well, as they were vulnerable to the warhead types, as again, the fragmentation warheads were enough to destroy soft-skinned military vehicles or civilian vehicles, along with clusters of infantry-type forces, which also included these groupings of dismounted armed reactionary civilians moving through the area, and artillery strikes landing in the area would simply eradicate these forces, along with fire coming from the combat engineers. Everything from their heavy machine guns on their IMR-3 armored engineering vehicles on the turrets, the DSHK heavy machine guns that also equipped not just the IMR-3s, but the MTLBs, and of course the infantry fighting vehicles that had 7.62 by 54mm coax, a 100mm main gun. There were even 30mm autocannons, as well as also even some that had Concor's anti-tank guided missile pods on the sides of their BMP-3s, as they were equipped also with ERA kits, as some had fully been decked out in ERA in terms of the turret as well as also the chassis, but others did not have the ERA kits on. It all depended upon how quickly the forces were able to get their vehicles properly prepared before the invasion had kicked off, because time was of the essence, and not all vehicle crews were able to install these kits in time for the invasion to start. However, this mattered little, as the enemies they were fighting were not prepared for the total power that these vehicles were already, even without extra armor upgrade kits. The firepower coming from these vehicles, as the weapons were staggered and they all covered different ways of the column, as again this vehicle was facing 180 degrees in the back, 180 degrees on the side, 180 degrees on this side, and they all had interlocking fields of fire on each side, so they could all fire at the same targets if they needed to. And with the artillery being guided in, with the artificial intelligence putting together strike packages based upon the ISR data from the quadcopter reconnaissance assets of each and every vehicle crew and dismounted squad, the artillery firepower was totally accurate and on point to where it annihilated these ad hoc counterattacks, as these armed reactionary civilians could see down the street what was happening, and also could see even further the mass destruction erupting from the Grad rocket battalion firing all of its systems into this area at one time, annihilating a massive segment of the city, as this was a 1 mile by 1 kilometer area. This area was taking a heavy pounding by the rockets, and once again now the howitzers were pounding this area as well, annihilating these groupings of armed reactionary civilians moving into the area, trying to assist and fight these combat engineers as they moved through the area, and destroyed these machine gun nests and smashed through the flimsy portable chain link fencing that was put up. As these combat engineers had stormed far heavier fortified areas than this was a joke to them and was very easy for them to eradicate. And as they had assistance from loitering munitions, even the Chinese Wingloong 2 dedicated combat drone hitting armed reactionary civilians that had taken to the highway, along with Chinese and Russian loitering munitions in the area, as well as CH-901As were also loitering over the highway looking for targets. These CM-502KGs and HJ-10 hits annihilated these groupings of armed reactionary civilians, including those on this street, the access road here. While this company of combat engineers, the other of both companies, out of the 6 companies moving down into the area, as one had come in from the side flanks, coming in from the west as they moved from the north and hooked west to take the cap, was now moving in and effectively pincering and closing off the cap building itself before sending in one platoon of combat engineers to seize the building and fight for control over it, as these forces were already eliminating everyone that was in their way in terms of the Texas paramilitary forces of the DPS and Texas Rangers who were guarding this structure and those inside. As these Russian combat engineers in this image here, as this is a wedge formation moving into the area, and this is a line formation including troops off this illustration or animation, if you will, they are bounding and covering tactically as they're moving now while they're laying down fire support, including with this strike from this RPG-29, as well as the light machine gunner with his RPK-74 and the rifleman firing at the enemy forces inside the building and just outside of it that are still alive beyond this machine gun nest, as the sniper on the roof had been eliminated by a loitering munition strike, even with another one still coming in. The Wing Loon 2 had swooped down, fired a missile after getting a missile lock at a target on I-35, firing behind this building, before moving back up to high altitude. And the artillery strikes were coming in hard into this area, destroying everything that was even left, guided by the quadcopter assets for precision targeting by the 2S-19 MSTA howitzers. The devastation wrought by the Russian artillery forces was absolute and had left the area in complete and total rubbled ruination, as the northern end of downtown, including where the cap sat, was now totally eradicated from all of the rocket and all of the howitzer strikes, including the earlier howitzer strikes, had already left much of this portion of downtown in complete rubble, as loitering munitions came in and struck. And this company moved south along the access road. They fired into Waterloo Park, and as these armed reactionary civilians tried to move out to attack the Russian vehicles, which they would have no success whatsoever at all against these very powerful engineering vehicles, which even included the actual armored engineering vehicles of the IMR-3s with their heavy machine gun mounts, and also the IFVs and the MTLB APCs. All the heavy machine guns on the APCs and the armored engineering vehicle, as well as also the very potent 100mm main gun, as well as the coax and also a 30mm autocannon, and the Concor's ATGMs, when used, were absolutely devastating on these forces, as well as were the loitering munition strikes that came in and hit them in conjunction with the vehicle-based fires. They didn't stand a chance as they tried to move out of Waterloo Park. There was a tributary running through it. And, of course, this is part of the local train system, the light rail, as this is a station and it goes underground from here. This area of downtown, of northern downtown, was absolutely annihilated, except for the cap building, which was now being fought over, as all of these MRAPs were also destroyed by the fire coming from the IFVs firing their 100mm shells and also 30mm autocannons with HE armor-piercing ammunition at these vehicles, and those with Concor's ATGM pods, those as well, and simply annihilated these vehicles with their light machine guns mounted as they were issued the M249s, which also were in these machine gun nests as well. All of these sandbagged machine gun emplacements with their paramilitary American forces were eradicated by these combat engineers, as these forces stayed outside as per SOP while these squads went in on both sides of the building. And even one squad being dismounted from this platoon moving here, as there are 3 combat platoons of this company moving into the area. One moving here, one moving here, and one moving here, completely surrounding again, pincering off the building, destroying all of these forces. The governor's mansion had already been eradicated, and it was being hit again as these armed reactionary civilians moved up through the area because it was located across the street from the cap. It was destroyed, and the other buildings affiliated with the state regime alongside of the cap complex had also been destroyed. The whole government quarter was basically wrecked except for the cap building. And that was only because not only did the Chinese want this for their own use, for the red zone after the rubble clearance operation would take place using the free slave labor from the locals, as well as also keeping a portion of downtown intact as the People's Armed Police Battalion would move into downtown and try to clear it as much intact as possible to use as part of the red zone, with the cap building being the colonial headquarters, with the nearby mega-fob and sub-fob of the Austin Municipal being able to provide security for the area as the garrisoned forces would protect the red zone, which would be the fortified Chinese communist equivalent of the green zone in Iraq. As the colonial project would be in full swing after the victory, this was a major objective, and the combat engineers were doing an outstanding job capturing it as their squads dismounted and their vehicle-based firepower let loose on these small-scale counterattacks by armed reactionary civilians moving into the area. Many were eradicated by artillery strikes and loitering munition strikes, but the vehicle-based firepowers, as well as also the dismounted squads, had wiped them out as well, as they had totally sealed off and had full fields of fire, not just against the building, as they also had 3 different squads go in to clear it, but they faced the building outside as per SOP, as they had squads over here, they had squads over here to provide also mutual support between their platoon vehicles and the dismounted combat engineer infantry type forces, and they were able to watch the flanks of this operation to capture the building, because these counterattacking armed reactionary civilians still posed a threat somewhat, but they were hurriedly eradicated by the vehicles and dismounted troops who operated in this area and eradicated these armed civilians and their technicals as they tried to move through into this area, and the combat engineers were fighting them off with their small arms, loitering munition, and artillery support, all of it ISR guided and AI guided by the strike packages put together automatically by the AI using the ISR data for such, as well as also guiding these forces on where to fire and their angle and traverse of fire and vectoring of firepower and movement as well. As they had successfully pincered off this area and had 1 platoon here, 1 platoon here, and 1 platoon here, blocking off the entire cap building and protecting it from these counterattacking forces moving through the area. All of them were destroyed, even though they tried to briefly fire on the vehicles and dismounts, and they would manage to wound a few combat engineers, but for the most part, the combat engineers had effectively had no KIAs in this operation and would have only a few WIAs, even as they were going in and clearing the inside of the building. Again, these were like elite assault infantry type forces, and the Americans were like novices compared to them in terms of the paramilitary forces of the Americans. They were nowhere near as experienced or well-trained as these Russian combat engineers were, who simply cleaned their clock, as the saying went, and would take some as POWs as well, because some Americans would see the futility in trying to defend this place after it had been fully surrounded by combat engineers, as well as also their ability to call in artillery strikes from their 2S-19 MSTA howitzers. They could see the rocket barrage as well that was occurring, the enormity of it, as all of the firing batteries of the rocket battalion, of the BM-21 Grad battalion, of the other divisional artillery battalion, as they had a Grad divisional artillery battalion and a howitzer divisional artillery battalion, were showering the area, literally just a block away, with enormous volumes of rocket fire after artillery had already pounded this area of the city and even destroyed a tollway, the Route 1 tollway right here, which was unimportant to the coalition. It was not like I-35, which absolutely needed to be secured and defended at all costs and could not be hit with certain weapons types, as the weapons available for use against enemy forces on it or near it were very limited, and everything had to be precise if using artillery. The closest the artillery could hit would be right here, which would destroy these buildings but not affect the highway, for example. Everything was absolutely precise. Precision was of the utmost in this operation. Everything was done with a high degree of precision. The forces operating executed their missions with a high degree of precision. And as these forces moved through the area with the support of loitering munition strikes, even their Winglong 2 Chinese combat drone hitting armed reactionary civilians bobbing and weaving through the abandoned cars that were now beginning to accumulate on the highway, as well as also Chinese and Russian loitering munitions in this area as well, hitting targets as a CM502KG blasted this technical and these dismounts on the other side of I-35 right here as these vehicles were moving through. As they briefly took fire, the missile came in and finished them off as this Russian loitering munition destroyed this technical, and Chinese CH-901As and the Winglong 2 destroyed these technicals, again trying to bob and weave through the southbound lane on I-35, as again they would patrol the highway, the main invasion route for the externals, with combat drones, loitering munitions, and other types of forces, as again, Americans were absolutely not to be permitted anywhere near I-35, as that was the absolute top objective of the entire Austin campaign, as well as all the other campaigns along its length. However, many of these major cities and medium cities along I-35 had other objectives as well, such as the political objectives, the military objectives, like destroying Camp Mabry, for instance, which was done at the very beginning, as well as also overrunning and destroying the headquarters of the 1st of the 355th, and hitting the bivouac sites and destroying the 2nd of the 198th, not even giving them a chance to do really anything in this battle. All of this, again, was executed with the utmost precision and professionalism, as the highly experienced Russian forces, as well as even the highly experienced Chinese paramilitary forces, again, who had a vast array of combat experience from constantly crushing uprisings anytime they had arisen in Xinjiang due to weapons being smuggled in and other bad actors. They had brutally crushed all of these uprisings whenever they had arisen, and also Chinese special forces and other combat and logistical elements from the PLA, their regular army, had been deployed to the Syrian civil conflict. So China absolutely had recent combat experience, although the Russians had combat experience at a massive level due to the length and duration of their proxy conflict they had chosen to fight as a war of attrition instead of a rapid war, which they easily could have also done, but they opted to do a long and slow grind to grind down not only the proxy nation, but also NATO and its hardware, which they had done an outstanding job of and had weakened NATO and all the NATO nations, including America, to the point to where they could barely project any type of power whatsoever at all. And the Chinese, who hadn't even had really done anything yet by that point, with their largest military-industrial complex on Earth, their largest aggregate of active and stored military hardware in the world of any nation on Earth, as well as their ability to mass produce all manner of weapons at freakish quantities, unimaginable levels, as the massive industrial complex, military and civilian, possessed by China was simply gargantuan. There was nothing like it in the history of humankind. They could effectively do what America did in World War II with its mass production, but multiplied several times fold. That's how massive Chinese industry and skilled labor was. They had more science, technology, engineering, and math graduates than any nation on earth. They had the largest skilled labor pool of any nation on earth, bar none. The world's biggest population besides India. And they had the biggest real economy on earth, and they had the most precious metals holdings of any nation on earth, including even their civilian population. China was exceedingly wealthy and could fund a war like this several times over. And as their forces were achieving rapidly their objectives in the Austin battle, the Cap complex was again being flushed out. Its defenders, which numbered 5 inside the building, not counting the machine placement side as well as in the MRAPs. They had all been either KIA'd or WIA'd and captured, or simply they surrendered and were taken POW by the Russian forces storming the building. And all of the political leadership and even the military commanders of the American Army National Guard of Texas and Air National Guard of Texas had all been taken alive. A massive coup in terms of the success that the Russians were able to achieve in this fight, as although they had used limited heavy weapons on this building, the damage was repairable for the most part, as this 100mm main gun had been fired through a window and blasted a massive chunk of the very strong building materials out of the wall and had wiped out the defenders inside. Fortunately, the intelligence that the Russians had, and the coalition in general in the more broad sense, was so accurate and so good that they knew exactly what rooms, what chambers all the political leaders were in, and they knew to avoid those in terms of firepower so that they would not cause any injuries or KIAs among the badly desired prisoners of war in the political sense. They were to be handed over to the Chinese for tribunals overseas, as all American leadership was to be held accountable for all their crimes throughout the decades, according to the Chinese. They would all be broadcast on live television for the entire world to see, as this tribunal would be a main event for the entire world. As Chinese victory, coalition victory more broadly, in this conflict would see China establish a massive overseas empire and become totally food independent, never have to import food from anyone ever again due to all the arable farmland, and even also inheriting all the additional resources for their gargantuan industrial base at home. The resources, the slave labor pool, and the arable farmland would make China have all of its national goals and dreams come to pass. However, a new war would begin after the invasion. It would be a war of occupation, but also insurgency, depending on which side one was viewing it from. As the Chinese would fight to maintain control, maintain their grip on their new colony, while the inhabitants that fled to the wilderness would be fighting like hell to try to evict them. And it would go on and on and on and on for years, with many millions of dead Americans as a result, as this would become a meat grinder for the American people. It would become a war of extermination and slavery and occupation when it came to the Chinese side. And for the American side, it would be a true war of independence in the very real sense, but it would go on and on and on, and it would create nothing but misery and death, mostly for the Americans. But even the Chinese would begin to get war weary after years of fighting for their foreign acquisitions half a world away, as they would pour immense resources into controlling this territory. They would gain much from their new colony, but all they would have to spend would make it seem like they were just breaking even, as this would be a very destructive and long-lasting conflict. As the Russians had succeeded in this objective, capturing the Cap building and eliminating or capturing the defending forces in this very savage battle, as well as eradicating armed reactionary civilians by the hundreds with artillery strikes, loitering munition strikes, and their maneuver elements' vehicle-based firepower. The combat in this area would wind up again with a Russian victory, and a massive oil painting of Xi Jinping would be put in front of this building, along with red banners decorating it now with the CCP party flag and national flag of China hung on the roof, along with the Russian flag, as they had the honor of capturing the building. It would fly right next to the Chinese CCP and national flags, and Xi Jinping would be honored with his oil painting in front of the building, as this was now to be New China. And all the allies of the coalition would respect that, as Russia got their own portion of North America that they were most pleased with, highly satisfied with, and all the additional resources and wealth it would bring them. As they were happy to partake with their beloved ally China, they had assisted in achieving this major political objective in the war in Austin. Just as the 8th Combined Arms Army of Russia had achieved the major political goals in New Mexico and Santa Fe, as the Chinese PLA had done the same thing in the Oklahoma City battle with their political leadership as well, capturing them alive with their special operations forces. As now this area was under thorough Russian control, as the Russian combat engineer companies, 2 of the 6 that entered this area, had, with artillery and loitering munition support, outright annihilated these broken civilian counterattacks into the Cap compound, as well as their vehicle-based fires, and dismounted troops and their firepower, simply wiping out the American paramilitary forces and armed reactionary civilian elements with ease, as their vehicles acted as mobile fire support platforms for the ground troops, who mutually supported them, as the dismounted firepower they wielded was very potent as well. And the tactical superiority and vehicle-based firepower and loitering munition support, even the Wing-Lung 2 combat drone supporting these forces, was all very potent in the realm of the capabilities deployed in this area. It only took 2 companies of Russian combat engineers to overcome the Americans in their hundreds in this area and seize control of this major objective, the Cap building. as the paramilitary forces again were all eradicated in their sandbag emplacements, as they trucked in sandbags and they trucked in the portable fencing that the Russians simply smashed into and annihilated with ease with their armored vehicles before deploying their squads in to take this building, while others remained outside to guard the flanks. The Americans in Waterloo Park were likewise crushed by this incoming combat engineer company, as all their vehicle-based fires and loitering munition-based fires simply eradicated them with their fragmentation warheads on AI target-seeking mode, with the heavy machine guns on the IMR-3 engineering vehicles and MTLB, APCs, and the very heavy firepower aboard their BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles. Again, along with the Wingloom 2's firepower, which was also very powerful, as once it got a missile lock on a target, that was the end of that target for good, as was the case with the CH-901A loitering munitions that the Chinese had and the Lancet 3s of the Russians on AI target-seeking mode. The rocket strikes were enormously destructive, just as the loitering munitions and also the howitzer-based fires were, and also the maneuver elements, the combat engineers, whether dismounted or whether vehicle-based. All of it working in tandem, combined arms, was absolutely devastating, and the combat engineers had seized total control of the north of downtown, as they had already pounded it earlier into submission, as earlier there were more armed reactionary civilians in this area, and all of which had been heavily shelled by the 2S-19 MSTA battalion after they had finished, along with the rockets, with the American installation of Camp Maybury, after it was totally eradicated by the artillery, missile forces, and air power that the Russians had brought to bear in the form of their Su-34 strike aircraft, dropping thousands of pounds of ordnance on Camp Maybury. As the other combat engineer battalion had crossed the river and had moved into the area, all they did was a BDA, a battle damage assessment. All of the staff of the Texas military leadership that was remaining on Camp Maybury were all gone. The number 8 building and all the other buildings of Camp Maybury were turned into a massive crater. There was nothing left but a smoldering ruin. And when the combat engineers moved into the area to occupy it, there was really nothing left. And they basically occupied a devastated portion of the city, as the other combat engineers followed up by mechanized infantry behind them to occupy areas that they had cleansed in terms of armed reactionary civilian opponents. They moved in and occupied the areas already cleared by the combat engineer companies of the battalion that had laid the pontoon bridge. And now, with the combat engineers holding the north of downtown, the People's Armed Police were clearing downtown, while Russian armor and mechanized infantry were moving through the south of the city, clearing it en route to take the last major objective, which was the international airport. But first, a major fight would erupt over downtown that would last for several hours, as Russian forces, armor and mechanized infantry, backed up by artillery, and also People's Armed Police forces of this battalion moving into downtown, would be fighting to control the future red zone, as the combat engineers would remain in the north of downtown, holding their recent acquisition of the CAP building itself, as the People's Armed Police would be fighting along with other Russian forces of the 207th Motor Rifle Division in downtown Austin to capture the rest of it along the Colorado River, as that was a very important objective as well, as it was to become the mainstay of the Red Zone, although the Cap building was to become the colonial governor's residence once the victory over America had been formally attained, and the colonization and economic exploitation operations conducted by the Chinese could begin, as this would be New China, whether the locals liked it or not. And they absolutely would not. And they would fight a long and drawn out insurgency against their occupiers. More to come in the next video of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth generation warfare doctrines, combining Trojan shock armies with the external components moving across borders with new, innovative, very real technology that China and Russia absolutely possess, as do some of their other allies. The battle over downtown next.